Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Philip Gooding. I am thrilled to be joined by Professor James Warren of Murdoch University in Western Australia. As many of our listeners will know, Professor Warren is the author of several books focused on the history of climate, environment and society in Southeast Asia. These include his works on the Sulu Zone, a book entitled Pirates, Prostitutes and Pullers, and another entitled Rickshaw Coolie, which I thoroughly recommend all our audience to check out if you've not already done so. Avid listeners to this podcast will know that Professor Warren was the guest on one of our earliest recordings when we discussed climate, weather, and monocrop agriculture in the colonial Philippines. In this podcast, we'll build on some of that podcast's key themes by discussing Professor Warren's latest book, which is entitled Typhoons, Climate, Society, and History in the Philippines, which was published earlier this year with Ateneo de Manila University Press. This book developed from multiple decades of research and represents a landmark in the historiography of the Philippines and in the discipline of climate history. Jim, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast again. Typhoons developed over a long time, and in fact, you state in your acknowledgement section that research began in 1983, finishing in around 2014. I just want to know more about the process. How did the project evolve in that time? Did you set out to produce a book like this when you started over 40 years ago? Or when did the project crystallize into this book?
Well, Philip, let me begin by taking you and your audience back to Manila in late 1982. The Sulu Zone had been recently published, and I was now working on the Singapore project, an urban social history about labor migration and colonial capital. That project was originally envisaged as a comparative study of three colonial port cities, namely Singapore, Manila, and what is now Jakarta, Batavia. I was in Manila then scoping source material for the project and also in search of additional Testimonio de Cautivos Fugados, or the statements of the fugitive captives of the Sulu Sultanate. While searching for further statements towards a future study of slavery in the Sulu Zone, I repeatedly encountered in various file series documents about bagyos, or Philippine typhoons. Downtown Manila was regularly flooding during the typhoon season from July to November in 1982 as the city's population expanded and welcomed transnational business and tourism on a hitherto unprecedented scale. There I was, standing in front of the archive on a stormy afternoon, carefully walking down a 12-inch wide wood plank from the archive entrance, pants rolled up to my knees, wading across a flooded lawn to the street with ankle-deep water surrounding me, hoping to hail a jeepney, the local transport. It was then that I experienced for the first time, but certainly not the last, the significant impact the storms and floods were having on the city. Standing there, as I just mentioned, in ankle-deep water, polluted also, outside the archive, drenched to the bone, and wondering whether I would make it back to my residence in time before the flooded streets would become completely impossible to navigate for the jeepney driver. I also realized in that moment it might be possible to research and write a history about the Philippines that differed from current frameworks of the political national imaginary, narratives primarily based upon anti-colonial struggle and post-colonial state formation. I want to now speak briefly about the methodological significance of a through source from the standpoint of the evolution and development of the Typhoons project. A through source in my own mind has certain characteristics I'm always looking for in the archive. Namely, the information in the source is consistent, homogeneous, and it reoccurs over time. Thus, it lends itself, temporally speaking, to being aggregated and formed into time series, whether a phenomenon, for example, like a cyclonic storm, an occupation, for example, like rickshaw pulling or sex work, prostitution, or a material object which has some value. In other words, it can be taxed or registered, like a Samal Bajala boat or a rickshaw itself. In other words, the registration process from a purely colonial standpoint, or a type of individual, a school prefect, a Roman senator, or a Chinese mandarin, or a rickshaw puller. It is a source which occurs on a regular basis, often annually, about which comparable data can be collected and compiled on a macro-empirical basis, often in time series, to discern social and environmental patterns, both short and long term, and to measure social and structural change over time. During the second half of 1983, while at Yale for 6 months, I began to collect quantitative and qualitative data published by the Jesuit-administered Manila Observatory, found in Yale's superb collections. Jonathan Spence, professor of Chinese history, was head of Yale's history department then and read my rickshaw coolie manuscript while I began to gather data towards framing the Singapore volume about prostitution, as well as a projected book about the historical study of Philippine typhoons. Over the next 2 decades, I made repeated trips to Manila to work with the largely still uncatalogued Spanish colonial records and related secondary materials held in the Philippine National Archive, the National Library, and of course the Manila Observatory. And in the introduction to Typhoons, I recount my first encounter with the still then surviving Jesuit records held at the observatory in a damp, dark room, neglected and forgotten. They were in a rather terrible state then and disorganized as well. The same situation existed then also regarding the uncatalogued state of the records in the Philippine National Archive. Miss Lina Concepcion, who was in charge of the PNA then, helped me organize the uncatalogued storm-related materials I located in various record series. For example, the Erección del Pueblo series, the various Provincias series, Naufragios, and as a result, I was able then to create, in effect, a new series with her help, Calamidades Publicas, bundles that brought together documents concerned solely with cyclonic storms. I originally conceived of the Typhoons project as a triptych in 3 parts with 10 chapters. But as the years passed and ever more qualitative and quantitative data was collected and a more comprehensive understanding of global climatic and meteorological conditions emerged, I eventually reframed the study in 4 parts, 23 chapters, including the introduction and conclusion. I had to reframe the study to take account of the variegated, albeit important nature of the accumulated data and the long temporal span of analysis, as well as attempting to stay abreast or trying to write the present as history as the climate and weather changed. The contextual and interpretive essence of the wider project had already crystallized into this book in my mind by the late 1980s. But the full tragic implications and impacts of the meteorological shifts driven by climate change for the Philippines did not become completely apparent to me until the 1990s, while living and working in Manila then, given the scale of the floods, the urban gridlock, storm damage, and disease dispersion that was occurring, especially among children, which increased as the intensity and scale of the storms and the population increased. And at the same time, the national and regional politics became ever more contested.
That's a fascinating history of the history that you've written, Jim. Thanks for sharing that with us. It's really fascinating the way that you've put together this archive or catalog this archive over several years. Now, one of the things that's happening in the background for all this, as you mentioned, kind of your personal experience in Manila, is that there's growing appreciation of extreme weather and its effects on current day societies. And this is reflected in scientific advances in understanding of climate systems and of the factors affecting typhoons over the Philippines and in the China Seas as well. And therefore, I wondered if you could also speak to where, how, and when did you access kind of the climatological materials, and how did you incorporate climatological sources and methods into your research, which was originally so archival in focus?
Well, apart from a proliferation of much wider access to evidence-based computer-driven meteorological data by the 1990s, I think most important has been the development in our understanding of the El Nino, which became a focus of intensive meteorological and historical research since the mid-1980s, but especially over the past 2 decades. This was most significant because in terms of large-scale phenomena in global meteorology, the El Nino reoccurs at regular intervals. The ENSO, El Nino, the warm phase, La Nina, the cool phase, southern oscillation, the oscillation in atmospheric pressure between the eastern and western parts of the equatorial Pacific, is an irregular cycle of warming and cooling of the Pacific Ocean, with changes in air pressure above and the sea surface temperature of the ocean, which can affect temperature and rainfall patterns in global regions over a long distance, a phenomenon now widely recognized and called teleconnections. Historians like W.H. Quinn and Richard Grove have stressed, and Philip, you too, that El Nino events are variable year on year, but historical reconstruction of patterns of events are possible. I want to stress here the real importance of collecting Spanish proxy data from the era of pre-instrument observation and ordering such data in time series to discern El Nino patterns, which historically have reoccurred every 2 to 7 years in the past. The Philippines, within the Southeast Asian context, is significant from a historical standpoint here because Spanish missionaries were on the ground in the Philippines for almost 4 centuries in the major urban centers and in rural settings all across the archipelago. And those missionaries made observations about changes in the climate and the weather, and they also, in some instances, as part of their role and responsibilities, specifically collected information about those shifts and changes. So when you put all of the data together that they gathered, that has survived in the archives, records of the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and the Jesuits, it's quite remarkable. Then there's also other important data here that needs to be noted in terms of proxy records, such as coral reef analysis over long time spans, soil deposit analysis, tree ring analysis, and ice core analysis. Proxy data from the archives of nature to supplement the written sources from the archives of society, all supporting our developing historical understanding of substantial shifts in climate and weather, but especially from the first quarter of the 19th century. Here, too, it is also important to note that the recurring patterns in terrains derived from such proxy data and more recent instrumental records are not just influenced by the variability of the climate and weather. Global processes and or root causes of social and structural change also altered and interacted with one another in complex ways to generate increased vulnerability. Macro contact wars, population growth, and environmental degradation have all been causes of vulnerability and disruption in the Philippines and elsewhere around the globe during shocking 20-year periods and 50-year periods marking the passage of remarkable typhoons in reconstructions of meteorological time spans. So, for example, historians in search of a global coherence could begin with the 1690s in China, the 1790s in France, and the equally disastrous 1890s and 1990s in the Philippines. Similarly, present evidence indicates that El Niños and La Niñas have never been more intense than in the last 100 years, as signified by fluctuating patterns of typhoons, floods, and droughts, a period for which we have accurate data, with the periods 1972-73, 1982-83, and 1997-98 recording some of the largest events on record.
Now, one of the core arguments, which you've just alluded to, is that vulnerability to the effects of typhoons in the Philippines has increased over the last 400 plus years since the Spanish arrival in the 1560s and up to the present. Can you, just for our listenerships, can you point to some turning points or specific factors in that long-term history? What specific changes have increased Filipino people's vulnerability to the effects of typhoons, and at what times?
Clearly, one of the most important factors has been the slow but progressive changes that have occurred in the scale and intensity of the weather as the climate has warmed over the centuries, especially since the start of the 19th century. Linked to these changes in the variability of the climate and weather and their destructive capacity has been a rapid rise in population from the late 18th century to the present, while a growing share of the devastation triggered by typhoons, so-called natural disasters, also stems from past destructive ecological practices as associated with the advent of monocrop export agriculture and the deforestation of large parts of the archipelago as it was integrated into the modern world system on a hitherto unprecedented scale, both at regional and global scales in the 20th century. Only a few decades remain to avert the fundamental threat to the environment posed by population growth, mineral and resource exploitation, poverty, and social inequality. In the 21st century, the consequences have been made worse by the scale of damage caused by the overdevelopment of floodplains, unfettered urbanization, and, as mentioned earlier, rampant deforestation. Climate change prolongs and intensifies typhoons. Tropical cyclones in Southeast Asia are now forming closer to coastlines, intensifying more rapidly, and lingering longer over land, according to the latest scientific research based on advanced computer modeling and simulations covering the period from the 19th century through the end of the 21st century.
Thinking about these growing vulnerabilities to effects of typhoons, now the book goes on the vulnerabilities of typhoons at various different points in time, from the Manila galleon trade to sugar plantations and on disease transmission, amongst many other phenomena. I suppose the question that comes from this is, what are the main effects of typhoons in the present, and how are these effects rooted in history? I suppose if we're going from the present to the past, when do we start to see the modern effects of typhoons in the historical record?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. There is a critical need here, in an attempt to answer your question, to protect the coastlines and stem the unfettered and unsustainable development occurring on exposed, densely populated coasts, as ever more people risk placing themselves in harm's way. The move to the coasts, triggered in part by the failure of land reform and redistribution of wealth in the cash crop agricultural areas of the country, has compelled people to migrate to large urban centers in the coasts in search of good fortune. The main effects of superstorms in the present is the scale and cost of the damage in terms of life and property. In the past, a large storm would have destroyed a village or town and displaced hundreds of people. Now a large storm can destroy a modern city like Cebu City in 1990 and Tacloban in 2013, and kill tens of thousands of people, displace millions, destroy infrastructure on an unprecedented scale, and hinder the stable development of agriculture, education, health, and well-being. Waterborne diseases caused by big tropical storm-induced floods in densely populated urban areas is a major problem, especially among children, the indigent, and elderly. Such destructive modern effects of typhoons begin to appear on a regional scale in the historical record as various typhoon-exposed areas of the Philippines were progressively integrated into the modern world system by the middle of the 19th century.
Thanks very much for that reflection. Now then, I want to return to something that you kind of alluded to in the answer to your first question as well. and this is about the state of the archives. And one of the ironies of your book is that the very phenomena that you studied, that is typhoons, also hinders historical analysis because, as you point out, typhoons have the capacity to destroy the documentary record.
Mm.
I suppose kind of one of my questions here is, how did the vulnerable materiality of the historical record affect your study? And is this an ongoing problem, or one that might be mitigated against in the future by, for example, greater infrastructural protections against typhoons, or even by digitization efforts?
Well, thank you for that question, Philip. There is a certain irony involved in trying to answer it, as my research has been markedly affected over the years in the Philippines by storms and floods, even well before I decided to undertake historical research on tropical cyclones in the Philippines too. In 1971, my MA thesis about the North Borneo Chartered Company's administration of the Sambal Bajo Laut was published in the United States in a major international area studies monograph series. However, I also wanted people in Sabah, East Malaysia, to have access to my research findings as soon as possible. So I sent a slightly abridged version of the monograph to the Sabah Society Journal for publication in the same year. The SSHJ sent the page proofs of my article to Hong Kong, where the journal was typeset and printed. Unfortunately, the printed copies of the SSJ with my lengthy contribution was lost at sea, as the ship carrying the printed issues of the SSJ with my 63-page article were lost when it sank in a typhoon in late 1971. Consequently, the article did not appear until late the following year. Then in 2009, New Day Publishers, who had produced all my books for the Philippine market for several decades, suffered a major setback when unprecedented flooding caused by Typhoon Ondoy damaged much of their warehouse stock, including a brand new book of mine about to be released for the public, as well as 3 of my other books in print, then stored on shelves in the warehouse in Quezon City. The print run of the new book was totally destroyed, while some of the other books were either also lost or water damaged. I purchased what little remained of the stock undamaged to help the press get back on its feet again, and donated those books to high schools and universities that had also been damaged by Typhoon Ondoy in various parts of the Philippines. Down through the years, all the archival holdings of the Philippines have been subject to the devastating forces of war and nature on the rampage. Typhoons, floods, fires, and earthquakes, and they have also succumbed to the ravages of termites, rats, mold, and rain. In the past, in moments of crisis, Spanish church and state documents have also been used as fuel for bonfires and torches, and wrappers for food and mats. There have been occasions in both the Philippines and Spain where I have opened the file and refused to touch the document for fear of it crumbling in my hands, or opening a legajo wrap bundle and finding the document riddled with silverfish, much to my surprise and dismay. Furthermore, since 1901, the location of the Philippine National Archives has changed 6 times. By 1960, the old Balidibid prison, built in the 19th century, was the final repository of all Spanish period government records. On several occasions in the 1950s and 60s, major typhoons hit Manila, delivering torrential downpours and floods. It was not uncommon for floodwater to flow into the decrepit building, rising above desks and halfway up the filing cabinets. Equally tragic, the sagging shelves stacked with bundles of documents were sometimes immersed in water, with both the archive and records exposed to extensive damage. The result of this flood damage was that the files pertaining to human-environment interaction have been damaged, scattered, and separated from the original series to which they belong. However, in 1970, Dr. Domingo Abella, the newly appointed director of the Philippine National Archives, and his staff took charge of the neglected Spanish records and moved them to the new, then modern National Library building. The National Archives team since then has coordinated the relocation of thousands of bundles of Spanish documents, inventoried undamaged material, and carried out the challenging task of cataloging in chronological and thematic order the millions of pages of official records, damaged or otherwise. Mitigating measures for the future include building suitable typhoon and flood-proof repositories for historical records and digitizing paper records and related historic materials concerned with climate patterns and weather whenever possible, and then circulating digital copies of these records globally to key research institutions concerned with interdisciplinary, collaborative related approaches to the historical study of climate change, and ensuring open access to such future records, collaborative research, and tailored computer simulations, especially on behalf of vulnerable storm and flood-prone countries. We should be acting now to assist and protect those who will be most adversely affected by the impacts of our warming planet and consequent future changes to tropical cyclones and their altered storm tracks.
That's absolutely fascinating, Jim. Thank you very much. Now, thinking about all this historical material and its cataloguing and the efforts you've put towards that as well, a considerable amount of the book is dedicated to appendices, which include, among other things, exhaustive tables of cyclonic storms over the last 500 years that have hit the Philippines, as well as some of their effects. And to my mind, this represents a wonderful summary of primary sources that researchers and university educators may use in the future. I kind of want to ask now, how do you hope that other scholars engage with the extensive work you've put into constructing these incredible appendices?
Well, I hope they will embrace them, Philip. The appendices provide the evidentiary basis of scaffolding that supports some of the major arguments and specific points that I attempt to make about how storms, floods, and droughts have made the Philippines an increasingly hazardous place to live since the 16th century, hampering its development and impoverishing its people. I would hope that researchers, university educators, NGOs, and concerned politicians will use the data in the appendices to bring about a necessary understanding of the changes required to help reduce emissions, so it will be possible to curb to some extent the impacts of future big weather. I hope, too, other scholars will use some of the information in the appendices in relation to their own work, like yourself, and in your teaching, especially in a comparative, transhistorical, and transcultural context. Certainly, some of the data in the appendices could be used for computer modeling and simulations as part of school research projects that could subsequently be circulated in high schools and universities. For example, like the historical typhoon map of the Philippines developed by Pablo Arroyo and myself under the auspices of the McGill and Murdoch-sponsored SSHRC-ARC research grants in 2016.
It's going to be wonderful to see how people work with these moving forwards. This is going to be my penultimate question. And again, I'm going to return to the present and the future, in fact. What is the present and future of the typhoon vulnerability nexus in the Philippines? In the book, you point to a period of unsustainable development that began under American rule and reached its nadir during the Marcos years, that would be the 1960s to 80s, and which significantly enhanced vulnerability to the effects of typhoons. Development is still a very big word in kind of global discourse. What does development look like now? Is it still unsustainable? Or is building typhoon resilience now built into development projects? And how successful or otherwise are such projects in your mind?
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah. Today, because of the historical and ecological origins of the development of underdevelopment, the least developed nations during just a half a millennium continued to suffer the worst excesses of environmental destruction. In the Philippines, the excesses are perpetrated by human institutions, in particular capitalist institutions, skewed in favor of a handful of powerful elite families and provincial warlords. Thus far, the Philippine government has not been able to regulate the power of elite landowners, transnational capital, and agribusiness to reorganize agricultural production on a more efficient and equitable basis. This stark political fact has caused some rural areas and agricultural export zones in typhoon-prone areas to shift further in the direction of fundamental dependence and deprivation. The long-standing ecological and social vulnerability of these areas suggests that the human environment cannot be made safe and secure until the limits prescribed by economic and social inequalities, cultural biases, and political injustices are redressed. A shift to an ecologically sustainable culture and equitable society in the face of big weather in this century in a country like the Philippines will not take place without a major transformation in the worldview and practice of the politically dominant minority. Making the needed changes through an ethic of sustainable development and reform of human institutions to avoid the catastrophic risks of climate change and extreme weather in this century is the greatest challenge the Philippines has ever faced if it is to improve the quality of life for all of its people.
Final question then, and this is the question I always ask to finish these podcasts. Yeah. What are you working on now? This is the end of a major project. I suppose the opportunities are endless.
No. Well, now that Typhoons has gone out the door and has been published, my aim now is to complete earlier work towards an interdisciplinary thematic book, the third in a series concerned with the Zulu Zone, a book about slavery, Islam, and cultural hybridity. I hope this work will promote collaborative and comparative research on slavery and other forms of unfree labor and hybridity in Asia. Manning Clark, notable Australian historian, tells us that the historian has to possess a vision that can allow the individual to research, write, and teach about the things that really matter. I have attempted during my life thus far to research and write history with a belief in the possibility that my vision will stir up a response among my students and a wider audience. I have been committed to teaching in context-sensitive research with a strong cultural ecological orientation for over 5 decades. A transhistorical, transcultural, and transdisciplinary approach is essential to the study of the IOW and Southeast and East Asia. It is especially critical, albeit essential, to opening up new horizons, developing theoretically informed historical analyses, and nurturing empathy for other people and places to understand their pasts and futures. And one final note, to paraphrase Joseph Campbell, remarkable scholar, teacher, and interpreter of some of our most sacred traditions, on the challenge of living in the world and practicing our respective fields of study. Our closing reflection. As you attempt to live the meaning of your lives and follow the way of your respective disciplines and individual journeys, you will certainly encounter John Donne's abyss or chasm. As you stand on the edge of that chasm, pass over. It is not nearly as wide as you might think. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm so thrilled to hear that you're going back to the Zulu Zone as well. And for your book as well. It looks wonderful on my coffee table. I also want to thank Sam Gleave Riemann for organizing and producing this podcast. And I want to thank you, the listener, for streaming or downloading. And once again, my name is Philip Gooding, and you've been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded Partnership, Appraising Risk, past and present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University, Montreal.